Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's Last Post ceremony. My name is Richard Cruz, and joining us today from the Australian Army is Warrant Officer Class 2, Peter Spiranak. Tonight we'll tell the story of Stoker Second Class Kenneth Francis Killeen, who died during the attack on Sydney Harbour in 1942. We're honoured to welcome Colonel Alec Dakar, Director of the Timorese Integrated Crisis Management Centre, Mr Domingos Pinto, Director General of Operational Services, Ministry of Interior, Director Civil Protection Authority, and the accompanying delegation. We welcome Mr John King, ACT President of the Return and Services League of Australia and a representative of the Naval Association of Australia. We warmly welcome representatives from the National Institute of Defence Study of Japan. Today also marks the 115th anniversary of the end of the Boer War. We welcome the ancestors of those who were involved in that conflict and who participated in the dedication of the National Boer War Memorial early today on Anzac Parade. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection by visitors and students on behalf of the following schools. From South Australia, the Hills Christian School, Verdun, Craigieburn Primary School, Flagstaff Hill, and from New South Wales, Toongabbie Christian School and Inner Sydney Montessori School, Balmain. Could I ask you to please stand and join in singing the National Anthem? If you're able, please be seated. I'd now like to invite to the lectern the Director of the Australian War Memorial, Dr. Brenda Nelson.
The most important year in this nation's history is 1788, the arrival of the first British fleet, the devastating impact upon Indigenous Australia. But from those events and that which would follow, the origins of the Australia that we have become and the people that we now are. The next most important year was 1942. And tonight we commemorate one of the most significant events in that year. After the imperialist, expansionist, militarist Japanese army had landed on the Malay Peninsula in December 1941. It rapidly progressed until the fall of Singapore in February 1942, when over 5 weeks 22,000 Australians would go into captivity. Days later, the attack on Darwin, the first of 68 on the Australian mainland in 1942. The strategic defeat of the Japanese, where the United States and Royal Australian Navies together stopped the Japanese planned naval invasion of Moresby, as a result of which, and the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Japan had no choice but to go across the hinterland of New Guinea. It's very easy from the safe comfort of our lives and 75 years from the events that we commemorate here this evening to allow the past to be a distant stranger. Our comfortable lives can breed easy indifference to individual sacrifices made in our name, devotion to duty and to our country. 75 years ago this evening, 3 Japanese midget submarines got into the very heart of our coastal part of our nation in Sydney Harbour. On the 28th of May 1942, 5 large Japanese submarines were 56 kilometres off the northeast coast of Sydney Heads. After some aerial surveillance of Sydney Harbour, where they identified USS Chicago, of course Royal Australian naval ships, and some other vessels, including at least 1 Dutch submarine, the Japanese submarines moved 11 kilometres off the coast of Sydney Heads, and then 75 years ago this evening, launched 3 Japanese midget submarines into Sydney Harbour. The first, just before 8 o'clock in the evening, got caught in a torpedo net, and the 2 Japanese submariners set demolition charges in their submarine and in doing so killed themselves. The second submarine got through Sydney Heads just before 10 p.m. It was identified by USS Chicago and fired upon. It survived that attack and then launched 2 torpedoes. One didn't hit anything and landed at Garden Island, ashore. The second went under the Dutch submarine K9 and landed under HMAS Cuttable, the Navy depot ship, killing 19 young naval ratings, Australians, and 2 British sailors. After 4 hours, that submarine, damaged, escaped from Sydney Harbour, and the 3rd miniature submarine arrived in Sydney Harbour, headed for Sydney Harbour Bridge. It was depth charged and destroyed, and the 2 submariners within it were killed. Such is the nature of the Australian character and makes us who we are, that those very brave Japanese submariners were buried with full military honours and their personal effects were sent back to Tokyo. The 3rd submarine, of course, was not found until 2006, just off the coast of Palm Beach, and one of those submarines we proudly display here in Anzac Hall at the Australian War Memorial. At this place there is no triumphalism, there is no demeaning of our former foes. And this evening, when you hear the story of just 1 Australian who died on that evening, please also give some thought to the courage, skill and determination of those young Japanese submariners and what they were able to achieve for their country.
Thank you, Director. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight we'll read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and operations over more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths and floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Today, we remember and pay tribute to Stoker Second Class Kenneth Francis Killeen. Kenneth Killeen was born on the 4th of October 1921 in Sale, Victoria, to Francis and Vera Killeen. Known as Ken, he grew up and attended school in Sunshine. He served as a member of the Royal Australian Naval Reserve and in November 1941, shortly after turning 20, transferred to the Royal Australian Navy for a 12-year term. He was sent to HMAS Cerberus for his initial training as a stoker. The work was tough, but at the end of his training, he was assessed as having a very good character. Colleen's next posting was to HMAS Penguin, located at Garden Island in Sydney Harbour. He arrived in May and was billeted aboard the converted ferry HMAS Cuttable, which was moored at Garden Island and used to accommodate sailors working on the island. On the evening of the 31st of May, 1942, 3 Japanese midget submarines entered Sydney Harbour. Shortly after midnight, one of the submarines fired 2 torpedoes at USS Chicago, an American heavy cruiser moored near Garden Island. Both torpedoes missed the cruiser. One ran aground and failed to explode. The second exploded against the sea wall near Cuttable. The ferry broke in two in the ensuing explosion and quickly sank, leaving just the uppermost deck exposed. 19 men from the Royal Australian Navy and 2 from the British Navy were killed as a result. One of those men killed was Stoker Second Class Ken Colleen. He was initially listed as missing, believed killed, but his remains were recovered in the days after the sinking. He was laid to rest with full honours in the Navy section of Rookwood Necropolis in Sydney. He was 20 years old. The Colleen family was devastated by Kenneth's death, and further tragedy compounded the sorrow. Soon after receiving news of her son's death, Vera Colleen, who was heavily pregnant, went into early labour. Due to complications during childbirth, both Vera and her unborn child died. Kenneth Colleen's name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my left, along with some 40,000 Australians who died while serving in the Second World War. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Stoker Second Class Kenneth Francis Colleen, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Could I ask you all to please stand for the ode and the last post.
They have no grave but the cruel sea. No flowers lay at their head. A rusting hulk is their tombstone, a fast on the ocean bed. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them. lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. We thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.